Welcome back to Seeking the Truth About the Sorter. My name is Tom, and I will be your guide as we spend this episode exploring Chapter 5 of Wizard's First Rule. Thank you for choosing to spend some of your precious and irreplaceable time with me. In our last episode, we were introduced to Dark and Rawl and learn he is hunting Richard, likely because Richard is the keeper of a secret book. Please note that these episodes contain spoilers, heavy spoilers, not just for this chapter, but for future chapters and books in the series. If you haven't read the series yet and you intend to, I'd encourage you to read the books first, and then come back and see what I think about them. Spoiler alert, I like all the stories in them. We begin the chapter with Richard and Kaylin entering the shelter of a Wayward Pine. Best estimates for the current Sword of Truth timeline place the story at the end of the first day. Every episode from here on will attempt to provide an ongoing timeline for how long the events of the Sword of Truth series take to unfold. We're given another example of Richard's familiarity with nature, while the author demonstrates his tendency to invest time and energy into preparing the necessities that make coexisting with nature easier. A wayward pine is described as a tall evergreen tree that grows without branches coming out of the trunk near the bottom of it. The branches have thick needles on them that weigh down the branches from higher up so that they touch the ground. They are so large, Richard is almost able to stand up inside one. They are fire resistant, and the branch density is high enough to keep out the rain. It is mentioned that the wood inside the wayward pine has had time to dry out, and according to the Cleveland Clinic, wood that has been kept dry for 6 months to a year can reduce the amount of smoke the fire produces, and smaller fires burn hotter, more completely, and with less smoke. For best results, they suggest firewood that's at least 6 inches in diameter or less. We can also deduce from the fact that Richard hasn't died from carbon monoxide poisoning that the length, shape, and direction of the needles on the branches must act like a rudimentary gutter system, functioning much the same way as the one Richard builds for the Mud People. It has 1,000 cracks to let the smoke out, but does not leak and let the rain in. Richard's harmony with nature is referenced again when he notes the long-tailed gar is the first thing he has ever encountered in nature that makes him afraid. The gar in the last chapter, being a symbol for attacks on logic and immune to rational discourse, is outside of a balanced natural order and is no longer a part of nature, but an overt threat. Kaylin tells Richard that she hasn't slept for 2 days, and that is because it would be a bad idea for her to go to sleep inside the boundary. Richard goes outside to get some water from a nearby brook and notices all the clouds moving past the moon except for the one that is following him. Goodkind sets up another positive association that will be subverted later in the chapter when he mentions the shadows melting and materializing as clouds pass in front of the moon. While physically Richard is cold and uncomfortable, the description of the cloud and the moon and the stars in the cold night air is serene, and will give a sharp contrast when the same language is used to describe the arrival of the shadow things, which can kill with a single touch. When Richard comes back shivering from the cold, Kaylin shares a blanket with him, and also shares that the gars are native to Dahara, and that the boundary between Dahara and the Midlands has been down since the spring. With Dahara so far away and completely inaccessible to Richard, combined with the fact that no one in Westland who knows about Dahara is willing to talk about it, have germinated an unverifiable fear that has sprouted into a palpable sense of dread and distrust. Richard turns the topic of conversation to his brother and references pieces of information that cast doubt on Michael's claims of logical foresight, saying it would be hard to make a living as a prophet predicting events that have already happened. The innocent sentence before this one is the most important part of the exchange, and begins an extended modified version of the 5 stages of grief regarding Richard and his feelings toward his brother, which is also a different way of explaining Richard's vulnerability to the wizard's first rule. Richard narrates that he struggled to make sense of the things he was learning, and in the next sentence makes a statement referencing Michael as the central hub where things don't add up. Richard is presented with a paradox about his brother's knowledge and his brother's intentions. Instinctively, Richard's actions follow the wizard's 9th rule, about paradoxes being impossible, and his mind starts trying to decide what piece of information is wrong. But without conscious direction and knowledge of the wizard's first rule, Richard tries to correct the paradox by introducing another. The vehicle that is used to solve problems is logic, and Goodkind formally establishes this as the single most important wizard's rule there is in Faith of the Fallen Chapter 41, when Zed formally identifies the 6th rule as, the only sovereign you can allow to rule you is reason. In Chapter 2 of Faith of the Fallen, Richard puts words to this sentiment informally, having arrived at the conclusion when he says to Kaylin, the first law of reason is this: what exists, exists. What is, and from this irreducible bedrock principle all knowledge is built. It is the foundation from which life is embraced. Since our own logic is not infallible, the wizard's first rule acts as a warning against placing faith in a message rooted solely on the words and reasoning of the messenger. This includes our own thought process. The field of metalogic, that is the study of logic, identifies over 100 different types of logical fallacy, that is, instances where faulty logic is used to arrive at a conclusion. And this series spends a lot of time showcasing many of the different forms of logic being used incorrectly to justify certain decisions and behavior. In this instance, Richard engages in an ad hoc explanation of how Michael's actions are not the cause for concern that the facts might suggest. An ad hoc explanation occurs when someone's claim is threatened with counter-evidence, so they come up with a rationale to dismiss the counter-evidence, hoping to protect their original claim. The ad hoc explanation Richard comes up with is that Michael must be doing this for the good of the public, and Richard introduces this as a new fact that he uses as the base to make future decisions. We're given a quick reference to one of Michael's methods of political assent, and that is information control. ScienceDirect.com and ChangingMinds.org both wrote articles that outline the technique of information control and explain how the withholding of information or the systemic and organized spread of misinformation is able to reliably and predictably sway public opinion. This is done by controlling the information that is presented to people in a way they perceive as being normal. If one source of information presents something to a person, they'll consider it as being possible. If all information from all sources a person receives is consistent, then this will be taken as being true. This dynamic is fleshed out fully in Chapter 53 of Soul of the Fire, when Bertrand says, "Others will speak the words we craft. We must at all costs remain above it. Look as if our hands are bound by a noble adherence to fairness." Dalton goes on to reference having men capable of delivering this message with the proper tone, and makes logistical arrangements to follow Richard and deliver his message after Richard delivers his. Michael describes Richard as someone who takes information and decides for himself if, when, and how such information is to be shared. And he references Michael's opinion that the coin of information should not be spent frivolously. Michael becomes the personification of a corrupt messenger. Using the structure of the tactic referenced in Soul of the Fire, Darken Rahl is the one who is completely removed from the situation, and is painted as an unknown but possibly sympathetic character, deserving the benefit of our doubt, with the long-term goal mirroring what Kaelin says further in the chapter about towns welcoming him with open arms when he occupies their cities. The message about fire being dangerous is presented strictly as a moral issue, with the benefit of the public good being presented as the sole reason behind it. Michael ties his own hands by delegating the decision to a group of experts who will look into the matter. Richard reveals that he has taken several sausages from his brother's party, and Kaelin makes a comment about his poor manners for taking leftovers. SouthernLiving.com wrote a lengthy article called The Etiquette of Leftovers. In almost every situation, it is considered to be poor manners to take leftovers from a party unless it is explicitly mentioned. However, they do say that in the home of a family member or the home of a close friend, that the leftovers rule may not apply. They go on to say that in specific circumstances it may be your civic duty to take said leftover pie. With the conversation centered on manners, Richard takes a moment to try and explain some of Michael's redeeming qualities. And here is where the author introduces some doubt about Michael's character. Up to this point, the narrative perspective about Michael is almost universally subversive, which suggests that Richard, as the source of that narrative, already has a deeper lack of respect for Michael than he voices out loud. While Richard rationalizes away his concerns with Michael as a speaker, he offers factual information that could offer a different explanation of Michael's actions than Richard's assessment of him as a narrator. The implication being that Richard has a bias narratively and doesn't pick up on a possible alternative explanation of the facts, even though he is the one speaking them. Richard says Michael seems less tolerant, snapping orders, and in a bad mood all the time. Richard immediately chalks this up to Michael being the type of person who is ungrateful and unsatisfied by their own success. Michael's bad mood and short temper upon obtaining his new position of power could be the result of an unexpected and unpleasant encounter with Darken Rahl. There is a case to be made for Michael's loyalty to his brother. It is a flimsy case. Michael's best defense is actually inferred but never verified by Goodkind's writing habit. There are no examples of protagonist characters who do not also possess personal flaws, and there are few examples of antagonist characters who do not possess a virtue of some kind. While it doesn't do anything to change the fallout of Michael's terrible life choices, at the very least he is a man who loved his brother, but he cared about doing good for others and himself even more. That is not to say that Michael was correct about what would happen under Darkenrall's rule, only that he sincerely believed it would have been good for West. Regardless, even a cynical perspective would admit that Michael is not the type of individual who likes to take orders. If he felt that he had no choice but to go along, and if nothing else, contact with Rawl could explain that without proving anything beyond it. Richard asks Kaylin about the boundary, and she seems surprised that people are not taught the history of the three lands in Westland. We learn that Richard's father and Zed used to live in the Midlands before he was born. Richard says that both his father and Zed told him it was a terrible time with a lot of fighting and that no good can come of talking about it. Kaylin starts telling him about the history of Panis Rawl's rise to power in Dahara and makes an allusion to the wizard's fifth rule from Soul of the Fire. Mind what people do, not only what they say, for deeds will betray a lie. When she says that the people of the Midlands had learned not to trust a Daharan peace treaty by watching what happened to the people of Dahara that signed them. Kaylin describes the formation of a new government of the Midlands to unite the lands against Panis Rawl. In this chapter, we only learn of the existence of the council, but not Kaylin's role as a separate branch of that government. The founding council of the Midlands could be described as an aristocracy, where lands sent people selected by their own monarchs and leaders to represent the interests of their land. It is similar in function to the United States Senate, but the representatives are appointed and not elected as they would be in a republic. We learn that there was a great war between the Midlands and Dahara, and magic was being used to influence the outcome in Dahara's favor. Kaylin tells us about the Shadow People and how they were the most deadly weapon used during the war. Conventional weapons have no effect on them, and being touched by one is completely fatal, but only after a gruesome and suffering death. At her mention of the boundary, Richard asks Kaylin for more information about the underworld. We learn that within the boundary, the regular world and the world of the dead occupy the same space. It takes 2 days to cross on foot, and if a living thing touches it without the protection of magic, they will die. Richard asks her more questions, and as Kaylin tells him what she saw, the narrative tone of her character shifts from being strong and confident to being weak, distant, and frightened. After Richard says, "Tell me what you saw there," he triggers a full-blown flashback. In an article for Psychology Today, Tom Bunn defines her experience as an explicit flashback, saying, "In an explicit flashback, the person is involuntarily transported back in time. To the person, it does not seem so. What they experience is being experienced as if it were happening in the present. An explicit flashback involves feelings and facts." Kaylin feels lost and alone and is reliving the experience of being tormented by the spirits of her dead sister and mother. Richard attempts to snap her out of it. In an article for TurningLeafTherapyServices.com, Casey Bigu, a doctor of psychology, lists several things you can do if a loved one is experiencing a flashback. The first thing Richard does is put his hands on Kaylin's shoulders and tries to shake her out of it. That is the #1 item on the list of things that you aren't supposed to do when someone is experiencing a flashback. Casey writes, "This may be extremely triggering for them, and the physical touch may inadvertently be experienced as part of the traumatic memory or flashback." That is exactly what happens as Kaylin tries to fight her way free from Richard's grasp. Richard then starts making good decisions when he keeps telling her to look at him, and by repeating grounding phrases like, "You're not alone," and "I am with you." Kaylin escalates her level of wailing, and when Richard shakes her again, she starts to drift away, and Richard forces himself to take control of his rising panic. This is the first recorded instance of Richard using his gift. Richard seeks the calm within himself and pulls Kaylin back from where she is. Goodkind often makes the association of Richard's gift being tied to his ability to find the calm center inside him. The calm centering is also a symbol for what the virtuous man does when he has a strong emotional response. The core message of that being, you won't be able to control the outside of your life if you cannot control the inside. At this point, Richard talks to her again and follows a much more textbook definition of how a person should talk to someone if they want to help them get through a flashback. He stops shaking her and starts talking in a calm voice. He repeats grounding phrases with more frequency than before. He keeps talking to her and finally asks her to come back to him. The written text of the chapter heavily implies that Kaylin's trip to the underworld was a result of a trap set to spring and keep her there if she ever thought about it too much, and also implies that Richard's gift shone into the underworld, guiding her back to him. In Stone of Tears, when the sisters describe how Richard was able to activate his gift on his own, they only state that the gift must be used to save another, they make no mention of the method the gift must use. It is possible that instead of a magical trap that Richard countered with a magical rescue, that instead Richard triggered a flashback when he asked Kaylin to recall the details of her time in the Boundary, which is number 2 on Casey's list of things you should never do. If you compound that with the extreme exhaustion of hard travel, combat, and non-hallucinatory PTSD, Kaylin has a large number of risk factors for a visual and auditory hallucination. Richard's use of the gift to save another may be more closely linked with what he does in Chapter 65 of Naked Empire, when he is guided to the proper medical solution of the problem he is having. Richard's gift may have guided him to the proper treatment for a PTSD flashback, and because Richard does not yet possess the ability to accept magic within himself, he rationalizes the contradiction by visualizing something he thinks would help. He visualizes sending her strength, and that the feeling of compassion might be the vehicle that he uses to draw the magic forth, as he does so in Temple of the Winds when he heals Kara and Kaylin. That is, the magic is not brought forth by the mechanism Richard describes as an unreliable narrator. His magic instead could be brought forth by the feelings he evokes within himself, and once the magic is summoned, he is able to use it to give himself the proper knowledge to help Kaylin snap out of her flashback. In severe situations, a flashback can last several days. In Kaylin's situation, that would have been far too long to be without the use of her rational mind. Flashback or magical trap, either one of those could have been decidedly fatal. As Kaylin recovers from her ordeal, the two characters bond together, as Richard uses his body heat to warm the inside of a blanket they're sharing. After an appropriate period of recentering herself, Kaylin pulls away from Richard and apologizes for her lack of strength. The flashback alternative theory doesn't fully explain Kaylin's description of seeing a light and feeling him pull her back, but a light representing her return to sense and sanity could have been integrated into her hallucination via a comforting light and feelings of safety. Fully recovered, Kaylin continues her story and says that once Panis-Rahl started using magic to create the Shadow People, the great and honorable wizard agreed to help. The way Kaylin phrases this tells us that there was a period of time during the war that the wizard had not agreed to help. And this is fully fleshed out in Dead of Bones, when it recounts the chain of events leading up to that decision. It states, "For a long time, when the war with the Hara started, Wizard Zorander wouldn't help us. He didn't want to fight, to hurt people. But in the end, Zed knew the only hope to save more lives was to fight." In this chapter, Goodkind reveals the first of many different allegories, usually rooted in the philosophy of objectivism and centered around 3 key parts: the virtuous, the vicious, and the innocently wrong. The virtuous are those who pursue their own rational self-interests, using rationality, integrity, honesty with oneself and with others, justice, independence, productiveness, and pride to describe the morality of their actions. The vicious man is one who pursues his own rational self-interest in a way that threatens the life of others for personal gain, ignoring some or all of the traits that the virtuous man follows. Between the virtuous and the vicious are the innocently wrong, people who adopt wrong moral philosophies or make wrong choices, not through evasion, but through an error of judgment. In Ayn Rand's The Objectivist Ethics, she writes, "Survival is the organism's ultimate value, the final goal or end to which all its lesser goals mean. And the standard of all other values, that which furthers its life, is good, and that which threatens it is evil." In this instance, Joseph Campbell's 17-stage monomyth, as described in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and not the model of circular storytelling, is a more useful model to describe Kaylin's account of the Honorable Wizard. The wizard is given a call to adventure to become involved in the war. He refuses the call to adventure. Supernatural aid in the form of Panis-Rahl's introduction of magic convinces him to accept the call to adventure and cross the threshold. The wizard throws himself into the belly of the whale and walks down a road of trials when he works to counter all of Rahl's magic. The steps of meeting with the goddess and woman as a temptress are both touched with the mention of Panis-Rahl killing the wizard's wife and daughter. The atonement with the father step is omitted from this example. Apotheosis is the last step of the hero's personal journey, the final transformation where they reach the pinnacle of their power, wisdom, and purity. And that is realized when the wizard puts up the boundary and sends wizard's fire through it to kill Panis-Rahl. The ultimate boon is referenced when Kaylin says, "At first everything was fine." Next is the refusal to return, in which the hero refuses their duty to return home and bestow their newfound wisdom upon the rest of humanity. In this case, the wisdom being to allow those who have succumbed to greed and corruption to suffer the consequences of their own actions. The next stage of magical flight is when the wizard leaves the Midlands and casts a spell that makes everyone forget his name and what he looks like. The next stage of rescue from without, when the hero is rescued from a final plight from an unexpected source, is omitted purposefully because of a conflict with the objectivist themes in the series. In The Sword of Truth, there is no higher authority than the virtuous man, and in his novels, Terry repeatedly puts the responsibility of personal salvation on the individual. The crossing the return threshold is satisfied later on when we learn the wizard left the Midlands and put up a boundary behind him so no one could follow. The Master of Two Worlds is satisfied when it is revealed that Zed, the lovable and knowledgeable cloud reader, is also the great and powerful wizard. Richard defends his freedom to live, and we're taken back to equilibrium, where the wizard is living his best life. This gives us a fixed point that allows us to begin a new story circle with Zed's call to adventure to help stop Dark and Rahl. The delayed revelation of this information is established here and allowed to go unresolved while it builds to a moment of anagnorosis, that is, a moment in a play or other work where a character makes a critical discovery. In Aristotle's Poetics, anagnorosis is the hero's sudden awareness of a real situation, the realization of things as they stand, and finally, the hero's insight into a relationship with another character, an Aristotelian tragedy. The single story arc establishes early in the series where the line is regarding the concept of moral obligation to the greater good. Since our life is a possession of infinitely precious value, the actions of a person to consume a portion of that life must be given consensually. And if a person feels that cost of intervention is too great or has no chance of affecting the outcome that is calling for their intervention, then the pursuit of a happy life is still a noble calling, and the individual is under no obligation to surrender any portion of that infinitely precious possession to repair damage others are asking be repaired for them. Within itself, objectivism states that acting in ways that go against virtue carries at minimum a psychological cost. However, even if wrongdoing carries psychological cost, there might be times when the short-term cost is outweighed by the long-term psychological and existential costs of doing the right thing. That is shown by Zed's commitment to kill large numbers of the innocently wrong at the expense of his own conscience. While he pays a personal price for that in the short term, he ultimately believes failing to protect an even greater number of people from being harmed would be worse. In Severed Souls, Zed defends an opposite course of action by stating that the inevitable may happen with or without our consent, and it may be beyond our ability to overturn the institutions that take joy from our lives. He tells Richard to remember the value of his own life and pursue happiness while he has the chance. Zed witnesses a struggle and, noting his inconsequential place in existence, decides he cannot change the nature of man to commit war on each other. He knows the sacrifice that would be required to fight such a thing and accepts his powerlessness in that situation by choosing to live his best life regardless of it. The dynamic changes when Panis Rahl uses magic to upset that balance. Zed recognizes that while he may not have the power to change the nature of warring nations, he does possess the ability to counter Rahl's magic with his own direct intervention. Zed knows the sacrifices he might have to make and consents to making them. After his unique ability to singularly change the outcome has been satisfied, Zed withdraws his consent to intervene and instead focuses on living his best life, accepting that the world will continue to turn without making a claim on his life. Kaelin tells Richard that many of the biggest cities in the Midlands have started chanting Rahl's name, calling him the greatest man of peace that ever lived, while the boundary was still up, and leaves the readers with the question of how he was able to do this from the other side of the boundary. We later learn that this question is answered by Rahl's ability to use subtractive magic, supplemented by his access to very specialized books of magic, giving him all the tools he needed to undo the boundaries. Kaelin mentions all of the people who are killed by the Gars that were able to cross over in the Midlands because the boundary was weakening at the top first. If we continue the allegory of the Gaul being a representation of weaponized, targeted messaging, then the description of how the Gars impacted the Midlands fits into that symbolism as well. The natural order of rational self-interest, as outlined in objectivism, is attacked with words and ideas designed to manipulate the innocently wrong into the support of a cause that ultimately goes against their own rational self-interest. Rahl takes his army and is welcomed by a gathering of people who feel the public good is best served by listening to the message of Father Rahl. The lives of those who question the merits of Father Rahl have their entire existence reduced to a single data point, and they are deemed irrelevant by their nonconformity to Rahl's message, and they are executed by large groups of people who justify their violence as unacceptable because it is carried out in the name of good. We see this dynamic present in the Crusades. Religious wars were considered a penitential exercise, and participants earned forgiveness of sins because the cause was so important that any means justified the holy ends. During the siege of Jerusalem, the Gesta Phrenicorum, an anonymously written account of the events, recalls the following series of facts. When the pagans had been overcome, our men seized great numbers, both men and women, either killing them or keeping them captive as they wished. Our leaders ordered all the dead to be cast outside because of the great stench. Since the whole city was filled with their corpses, and so the survivors of the attack were made to drag the dead outside the city gates and arrange them in heaps. A more contemporary example of this dynamic can be found with those who influence the differences of opinion on governance and social issues, and when they use their influence to raise chosen causes to the level of an absolute and incontrovertible crisis. All traits of the virtuous man become secondary to the single choice, and physical, personal, and social violence are excused in defense of the greater good. Rahl accomplishes this by establishing himself as the ultimate messenger of peace, and therefore any attack against him is an attack on peace itself. Mixed in with the innocently wrong are the innocently virtuous. The innocently wrong are the flies of the gar, and they make attacks to provoke a response from the innocently virtuous. The response to the threat directly, without the ability to overpower their violence directly, prompts a lethal response from the peaceful crowds gathered to celebrate the noble cause they're a part of. Richard and Kaelin are portrayed earlier in the book as being in a similarly powerless situation. It is only through the exercise of reason that they recognize their lack of ability to overpower the situation by force, despite their natural instincts to immediately fight back. While morally there is no difference between Richard, Kaelin, and the innocently virtuous, as they respond to the weaponization of the wizard's first rule, the innocently virtuous become innocently wrong when they break the wizard's third rule and allow their desire to fight back to overwhelm their ability to recognize that they do not have the power to confront the threat in front of them. A less lethal example of this dynamic can be found in almost every politically or socially charged exchange within the comment section of social media. One group feels their sense of agency is threatened, and in an emotional response to that threat, a comment is made without the power to change the outcome, and both parties experience pathos towards each other. The emotional response only deepens the level of damage. By comparison, the denial of emotion produces a rational response of non-engagement. A less lethal example of this dynamic can be found in almost every politically or socially charged exchange within the comment section on social media. One group feels their sense of agency is threatened. In an emotional response to that threat, a comment is made without the power to change the outcome. Both parties experience pathos towards each other. This emotional response only deepens the level of damage. By comparison, the denial of emotion produces a rational response of non-engagement. Sometimes an alternative to non-engagement is an empathetically aware interaction that explicitly denies all emotional arguments without dismissing the fervor of the person giving them. There may be a path to change someone's mind, but there will likely be a personal cost associated with pursuing that path. This dynamic is similar to Zed's choice to involve himself in the Midlands. He feels he has the power and consents to use his talents towards that goal. Finally, Kaelin drives the point and the analogy home when she adds that Darkenrall came to the council and asked them to join him in an alliance for peace. Those who joined him were heaped with praise and called good citizens. Those who did not were branded as traitors and summarily executed. When confronted by the consequences of their own actions, the remaining wizards began to see the contradiction between Darkenrall's actions and his message of peace. Darkenrall's overthrow of the council results with his installation as a new dictator. According to Machiavelli, the only difference between a dictator and a monarch is the purity of the intent to do good for their people. Kaelin tells Richard that Darkenrall immediately outlawed the use of magic and fire. Kaelin goes on to say that Darkenrall doesn't explain his orders, but his followers try and explain them in different ways. This echoes the dynamic laid out earlier, how Darkenrall keeps himself separate from his message and lets others spread his words for him. Kaelin mentions that Richard's brother Michael sounded like he was close to outlawing fire. Richard cuts her off in the middle of a sentence that sounds suspiciously like she is about to connect the dots between important people in the Midlands being influenced by Rahl ahead of the boundary coming down near Dahara, and Michael forming a commission to discuss possible fire control regulation. Richard's response closely mirrors many of the 10 signs you are in serious denial, as referenced by NorthPointRecovery.com. He avoids talking about the situation when he interrupts Kaelin. Richard uses other people's behavior to prove that there isn't a problem with Michael, since other worse people would never think to pay off the family's debt while their father was away. He tries to ward off future concern when he tells Kaelin, that's all, he just doesn't want anyone to go through what we did. He denies the problem absolutely when he says, That's why Michael is concerned about fire. That's the only reason. Richard rationalizes his brother's behavior when Caitlin points out that Michael doesn't seem to care about hurting him. He says, "I know it seemed that way, but you don't understand him." Finally, in this scene he doesn't show a stint of sobriety, but that is because he is in the middle of a relapse. His stint of sobriety was when he was angry with his brother for putting his hands on Caitlin. Richard uses emotional gaslighting to make Caitlin feel like her only two choices are to be a good person and accept Richard's explanation, or to be a bad person and continue to challenge him. Richard succeeds, and Caitlin apologizes for her behavior and drops the matter entirely. During Richard's defense of his brother, we get strong evidence that Michael is not without a sense of loyalty to his family when he sells off one of his father's artifacts, albeit at a grossly inflated price, to one of his wealthy friends. At the same time, we're also shown a part of Michael's personality that confirms he's not shy about hurting others if it means he'll get what he wants. Caitlin mentions it when she criticizes Michael's behavior during his speech, and Richard himself admits it without realizing during his story. It is possible that Michael would pay off most of his family debts for selfish reasons, if his well-connected friends were looking down on him because his family was poor, and had enough debt that 3 full gold pieces weren't enough to pay it off. I tend to shy away from this irredeemable Michael theory because Goodkind has a habit of taking good characters and showing how they are corrupted by a lack of adherence to the wizard's rules. I think the author was referencing this tendency when he mentioned Richard's habit of making noble characteristics with his stone carving, only to later deface them to suit the taste of the Imperial Order. I think Goodkind enjoys the pathos that is created when his antagonistic characters with redeeming qualities are irreparably damaged by their rejection of virtue. In Chapter 34 of Stone of Tears, we're told by Master Hillman that the current exchange rate of gold to silver is 40.55 to 1. For purposes of this exercise, we'll round that down to 40. In Faith of the Fallen, we learn that 50 iron bars cost 3.5 gold marks, and Richard is just barely able to carry 5 of them at the time while transporting them to Victor's blacksmith foundry. The United States Marine Corps standard of physical fitness states that a soldier should be able to carry 150 pounds of gear for 9 miles. We also learn that the steel bars are too heavy for Nikki to lift even one of them. Assuming that Nikki is exceptionally weak physically, and without giving Richard superhuman strength, I think it's safe assumption of 30 pounds per bar can be used as the maximum weight for each bar, if Richard is able to carry 5 of them for any measurable distance. Promise I'm going somewhere worthwhile with it. Today, a pound of steel made with modern manufacturing techniques can cost upwards of 80 cents per pound. Converting the cost of 50 steel bars at 3.5 gold marks and the 1,500 pounds of steel into a $1,200 value for the material. In today's dollars, we find that 1 gold piece is worth roughly $340. Given the level of technology and the greater importance of a precious metal-backed currency system, the 1800s are an acceptable financial frame of reference. Adjusted for inflation, 3 gold coins converts to roughly $20,000 of debt for the Cipher family. Since Michael only paid off most of the family debt, that means the Cipher family was on the hook for a brand new Honda Civic, complete with a couple of deluxe options. Using the current value of gold in November of 2020, that would make each coin weigh about 6 grams. For comparison, a US nickel weighs 5 grams, making the gold coins in the Sword of Truth series slightly larger than a nickel and having the purchasing power of around $7,000 each, when adjusted for inflation. Silver coins, then at a 40-to-1 conversion, are worth $175, which is consistent with the statement made in Faith of the Fallen when Richard tries to sell both his horses for 5 silver marks, with a total purchasing power of $875. The man is correct when he says 2 horses are worth much more than that. In today's dollars, the value of a single trained riding horse ranges from $1,000 to $2,000 each. A big enough difference to give any man with a conscience a feeling they are taking advantage of someone. Caitlin then references the MacGuffin of the series. A MacGuffin is a term used in storytelling to describe an object or device in a movie or a book that serves as a trigger to the plot. Darkenroll is seeking magic that will allow him to become the ruler of everyone without having to fight a war. In addition to the 5 wizards who killed themselves, we learn from Caitlin that one wizard sold his services to a queen, and she does not look favorably on him for that. Darkenroll is once again elevated through the practice of power scaling, when we learn that the combined might of the 5 wizards who killed themselves and the old wizard are no match for Darkenroll. Caitlin announces that her mission is to find the old wizard and have him make the appointment only he can make. She also tells Richard that she has the power to force the old wizard to do that, while the other 5 wizards who helped her did not. Richard mentions that Zed is a cloud reader, and that cloud readers specialize in finding people. Caitlin says it sounds like magic, and Richard says that Zed always used to tell him, ironically, that he must have magic to be able to read the clouds and know the future. Richard makes a plan west to outrun the next squad that he assumes must be after her by now. Caitlin gives Richard a salve to help the fly bites heal. When he applies it to the wound on his hand, he's disappointed that it doesn't help him feel much better. The author uses Richard's analysis of the healing salve as a credibility transfer of medicinal authority to Zed when he recalls Zed teaching him how to make a similar ointment. By acknowledging him as a teacher, Richard is regarding him as an authority in that field. Kaelin asks Richard if he is afraid of magic. This is a loaded question that has the capacity to be highly divisive. Most would think there are only two answers to this question, yes or no. But neither of those choices are the correct answer to the rational man. In the book Logical Self-Defense by Johnson and Blair, written in 2006, they define informal logic, which uses acceptable premises that can arise for practical reasons to reach a certain goal, and often include presumptions or presuppositions. In 1996, Douglas Walton from the University of Windsor defined this type of argument as presumptive reasoning in his paper Argumentation Schemes for Presumptive Reasoning. Instead of accepting that there are only two answers that are correct, Richard engages in presumptive reasoning to conclude that there are some instances of magic you should fear, and some you are glad to have found. Kaelin smiles at his answer. This is most likely the same kind of smile a person gets when someone says or does something that makes you elevate your opinion of them. Kaelin says she will allow Richard to see a creature of magic if he agrees that he will leave when she asks him to, and not ask her any more questions when he returns. Richard agrees to this. Kaelin pulls out a small bottle that has a shining light inside and says the creature inside the bottle is a night wisp, a creature of magic that can only be seen at night. The night wisps very closely resemble will-o-wisps. European folklore typically describes will-o-wisps as ghosts, fairies, and other spirits. Modern science explains them as the natural phenomena of bioluminescence or chemiluminescence, caused by the oxidization of phosphine, diophosphane, and methane produced by organic decay, which explains why the folklore of wisps is traditionally linked to expansive collections of standing water and dense vegetation, like swamps or bogs. Kaelin introduces Richard to Shar and says that she was an important part of the magic that allowed her to cross the boundary as her guide. Kaelin says that tonight is when Shar will die because night wisps cannot survive from their homes for extended periods of time. Kaelin seems to be in better control of her emotions now because even though her eyes become watery, her voice remains calm. This behavior could also be an example of her grieving process. Of the many different ways that people choose to grieve the loss of a person who is close to them, Kaelin often demonstrates her grief through an action. Much like the raking of a sand garden or the trimming of a bonsai tree, they use a physical action to help them tackle and process difficult emotions. Kaelin, in this instance, resolves to show strength towards Shar, because it is her sacrifice that allowed her to get this far, and by her own reasoning, if she were to show sadness or weakness, Shar would be compelled to offer her own strength to comfort her, when Shar is the one that should be considered for such things instead. Shar introduces herself to Richard, and she thanks him for helping Kaelin. Shar makes an offer to Richard that does not resolve until the 10th novel, Phantom, when she says that no enemy would know the name Shar, and if he ever found himself in the land of the night wisps, all he had to do was mention her name, and her people would help him. Richard thanks her and says that his only intention is to help Kaelin find the old wizard before they both travel west and hide until it is safe. If you're using Campbell's hero's journey to describe this interaction, this would fall under the step refusing the call to adventure. The next passage mentions Shar having to think about what she wants to say to Richard after he says this. Finally, she tells him that if that is what he wishes, then that is what he must do. Much later on, we learn that Richard's interactions with Shar was a test from First Wizard Baracus, a test he wasn't ready to pass. We later learn that the Night Wisps were trusted with Baracus's personal library, and his words to help the right person find what he needed from there were passed down through many generations of Night Wisps. Given this information, it makes a lot more sense why Shar would agree to go with Kaelin on her journey. In addition to recognizing the threat of Dark and Rahl, she had access to instruction and prophecy passed down from Baracus regarding someone who would be the counter to the real threat of Jagang the Dreamwalker. In Chapter 36 of Wizard's First Rule, Zed is able to identify several key prophecies being referenced by the phrase, the Last Mother Confessor. Baracus would have been aware of, if not the author, of some of these prophecies. It is very likely that Baracus passed down the importance of accepting this call to adventure to the Night Wisps as well. Otherwise, Shar would have had no way of knowing that Richard was the right person to test regarding the book they were holding on to for him. It also explains the willingness of Shar to sacrifice herself in this way. Baracus has been gone from the world for so long that his words have risen to the level of mythos among the Night Wisps. We learn in Phantom that the Night Wisps care little for the problems of the world, and that convincing them to do anything is a difficult task. However, a sacred and heroic directive from the past that carries the full weight of the ancestors who passed it down from one generation to the next would provide the type of motivation that would convince a person to sacrifice their life for the greater good. Shar tells Richard that if he runs, Dark and Raw will find him and kill him. Richard goes through the 5 stages of grief when he hears this. Denial occurs at the mere mention of the Midlands. He rejects the possibility that he would ever go there, flat out. Richard skips the stage of anger and moves straight to bargaining when he asks if there is another way for them to escape. Shar tells him no, and he descends into depression when he asks her, is there nothing they can do at all? Shar gives him a clue about his future when she tells him the answer is within him and that he has to seek it, and that he must seek it or Dark and Raw will kill them both. The answer within him is his gift, and with that the first part of the wizard's 13th rule, the unwritten rule that states that knowledge is earned and not given. He is the only one, and he will have to figure it out himself because no one can do it for him. Her second reference is to plant the seed of seeking. Richard will be the seeker of truth. Shar would know that from the knowledge Baracus passed on to them. All she can do at this point is tell him to seek for answers. Shar tells Richard that on the first day of winter, if nothing is done to stop it, Dark and Raw will achieve a total victory, and everyone will die. Richard reverts back to bargaining when he hopes Shar is holding out on him and could offer useful information if he can convince her it is important enough. Shar does realize the importance of this, as well as the importance of prophecy, and withholds the information Richard asks for, and gives him the information he needs instead. She repeats the message that he must seek the answer or die. Richard asks if she knows why Rawl is trying to kill him, and if it was for different reasons than helping Kaelin. This is a clear reference to Richard's knowledge of the Book of Counted Shadows. Shar gets excited about that when she asks, other reasons? Secrets? She's referencing that he must figure out that the book Secrets of a War Wizard's Power is hidden with the Night Wisps before he will be allowed to go there. Richard would have no way of knowing this and does not pass the test, so Shar remains the keeper of Baracus' word. Richard again visits the stage of depression, and Shar tries to comfort him, which is exactly what Kaelin was trying to avoid. Richard realizes this and forces himself to remember that Shar is the one who's going to die soon. Shar thanks Richard and tells him that she knows he has what he needs within him to succeed, another reference to the gift of a war wizard's power. Shar becomes the next person who calls Richard a rare person. This time she's praising his unique heritage and the important role Shar knows Richard is going to play in the upcoming days and years. Shar seems to know that there are no guards around and asks Richard to leave so she can be with Kaelin. When Richard leaves, Shar refers to Kaelin as the Mother Confessor and asks her why she hasn't told him her secret. Shar tells her it isn't fair to Richard to keep the secret from him. Kaelin agrees, but says she needs to keep her power a secret because Richard is the only friend she's ever had. Shar says that other people might tell him first, and that would be worse, and that he might fall in love with her before that happens. She also asks Kaelin if she would choose him as her mate. Kaelin says she would never do that to someone she cares about. Shar is again doing what she can to direct the course of prophecy where it needs to go. She does this by first trying to keep Kaelin from doing something early in their relationship that would damage Richard's ability to trust her. If Shar knows that Richard will be the Seeker and Kaelin is the last Mother Confessor, she also knows that Richard and Kaelin will fall in love and find a way to be together. This is an attempt to protect Richard's ability to love her completely without a speck of doubt. If Kaelin betrays Richard too deeply, Shar fears that Richard may not be able to protect himself against her Confessor's power, and all will be lost. Shar also plants the seed of Richard and Kaelin being together by asking if he will be her mate, because by asking the question, she gets Kaelin to admit to herself out loud that she cares for Richard, and she wouldn't do that to someone she loved. Shar gives Kaelin comfort and says she wishes to stay and talk to Richard more. That statement carries much more weight after we learn the Night Wisps have been waiting for Richard to appear for thousands of years. Shar tells Kaelin to use her power on her. Kaelin doesn't want to, but Shar says she's in a lot of pain and reminds Kaelin that she owes her a debt that can never be repaid. Kaelin agrees and uses her power on Shar. We get our first glimpse of how a Confessor's power works when Shar says, "Thank you, goodbye, my love," right before she dies. Richard comes back and immediately breaks his promise not to ask her any questions by asking, "Shar?" Kaelin answers his question, and they both lay down to go to sleep. Richard's moment of dread is when he arrives at the 5th stage of grief, acceptance, and falls asleep, hot with the fever caused by the wound on his hand. It's time for the official #1 quote from Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth in Wizard's First Rule, Chapter 5. Please note that the views and opinions of what the official #1 quote from this chapter is may differ from the views and opinions expressed by you about what your #1 quote from this chapter might be. In the event that your #1 quote is different from the one mentioned here, please list your candidate for #1 quote in the comments below. And the official #1 quote is, "As punishment, the wizard did the worst thing possible for them. He left them to suffer the consequences of their own actions." In the next chapter, Richard and Kaelin complete their journey to Zed's house, and we learn more about Richard's secret, as well as the boxes of Orden. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you feel feel like you've gotten something of value from this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you really like it, I ask that you share a link to this video with those who you might think would enjoy it as well. If those feelings are not there yet, I invite you to come back for the next episode and give me a chance to try and change your mind. Thank you for watching. My name is Tom, and I've been your guide. This has been Seeking the Truth about the Sword of Truth. Come and join me next time, so while I am seeking these truths, you can become seekers of that truth as well. Thank you. I hope to see you again.